My dad was the greatest. My dad was always good to me. He was the first man who ever held me, first guy I ever looked in his eyes, and I fell in love with my dad.
For a brief moment in the 1980s, it seemed entirely possible that Steve Guttenberg would become the next Tom Hanks. They were both warm, approachable, and possessed that rare quality audiences instantly trusted. Neither relied on the rugged charisma of an action hero or the brooding intensity of a dramatic superstar. Instead, they represented something that Hollywood has always struggled to replace: a genuinely decent man. Yet while Tom Hanks went on to become one of the most celebrated actors in film history, collecting Academy Awards and unforgettable roles, Steve Guttenberg slowly disappeared from the spotlight. The mystery isn't that he lacked talent. It isn't that audiences stopped liking him. The real question is far more fascinating. How could two men who started on such similar paths end up living completely different Hollywood stories? And perhaps even more importantly, what if the decision that changed everything wasn't made on a movie set, but inside Steve Guttenberg's own heart?
To understand that answer, we have to travel back long before the bright lights of Hollywood. Long before magazine covers, blockbuster comedies, and sold-out theaters, Steve Guttenberg was simply a teenager growing up on Long Island, New York. He wasn't the most popular boy in school, nor the most naturally gifted performer. By his own admission, there always seemed to be someone more charismatic, someone funnier, someone who captured attention more easily. In school productions, he often found himself standing just outside the spotlight, quietly studying the craft instead of commanding the stage. But sometimes the people who begin in the background learn lessons that stars never do. Steve developed patience, persistence, and perhaps most importantly, humility. Behind every successful child is often one remarkable parent. And for Steve, that person was his father, Stanley Guttenberg. A former Army Ranger and later a New York City police officer, Stanley could easily have become a strict and intimidating father. Instead, he chose something far more powerful. Having grown up with a distant parent himself, he decided his own son would never question whether he was loved. Steve would later remember a father who came home every evening, who put family before everything else, and who believed encouragement could accomplish far more than fear ever could. When most parents might have tried to protect their teenage son from chasing an impossible dream, Stanley reacted in a way Steve never forgot. At just 17 years old, Steve announced that he wanted to leave New York and move across the country to become an actor in Los Angeles. It sounded reckless. It sounded unrealistic. But the next morning, his father quietly sat beside his bed and offered only a few simple words that would shape the rest of his son's life. "Good choice. Let's see what happens next." Those words became more than encouragement. They became a philosophy. They taught Steve that life wasn't about fearing failure, but about embracing whatever adventure came next. Carrying only a few $100s, a suitcase packed by his mother, and the unwavering belief of his father, he set out for California with no guarantees, no connections, and no certainty that anyone would ever remember his name. He simply hoped that somewhere beyond the horizon, luck might finally meet determination, and together open the first door to a dream that seemed almost impossible. When Steve Guttenberg arrived in Los Angeles in 1976, he wasn't greeted by opportunity. He was greeted by uncertainty. Like thousands of young dreamers before him, he carried little more than hope, a few $100s, and the quiet confidence that his father had placed in him. Hollywood wasn't waiting for another unknown actor. It certainly wasn't looking for someone who didn't have famous relatives or powerful connections. Every studio gate seemed designed to keep people like Steve on the outside.
But if there was one quality he possessed that couldn't be taught, it was determination. Rather than sitting by the telephone hoping for an audition, Steve went looking for one. In those days, there were no emails, no online casting websites, and no social media where aspiring actors could introduce themselves. There were only studio lots, security guards, and endless rejection. Steve became remarkably resourceful. He found ways to enter studio properties, blending in with employees, then spent his days calling agents and producers, introducing himself and asking for opportunities. It sounds almost unbelievable today, but that relentless persistence slowly began opening doors that talent alone could not. The first roles were small, almost invisible. A television commercial here, a supporting appearance there, and a handful of projects that disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. One early leading role failed to make much impression at the box office, reminding Steve that in Hollywood, one disappointing film could erase months of hard work. Yet unlike many young actors who allowed failure to discourage them, he treated every setback as another lesson. His greatest strength wasn't that he always succeeded. It was that he kept showing up after every disappointment. Then fate intervened in the form of an unexpected phone call. His agent informed him that he had been cast in The Boys from Brazil, a prestigious international thriller featuring some of the most respected actors in the world. Suddenly, the young man who had once struggled to get through studio gates found himself sharing scenes with cinematic legends whose names already belonged to Hollywood history. Instead of feeling intimidated, Steve watched carefully, absorbing everything he could. Years later, he would remember not only their extraordinary talent, but also their kindness. That experience quietly shaped the kind of actor and the kind of person he wanted to become. The momentum continued building. In Barry Levinson's Diner, Steve revealed a different side of himself. Rather than relying on broad comedy, he brought vulnerability and sincerity to an ordinary young man trying to navigate love and adulthood. Audiences recognized something authentic in his performance because it wasn't manufactured. Steve wasn't pretending to be the nice guy. He genuinely was one. Soon afterward came The Day After, the television event that stunned America. Watched by more than 100 million viewers, the powerful drama proved that Steve Guttenberg could handle serious material just as convincingly as comedy. By the early 1980s, without much fanfare, Hollywood had begun to notice him. The biggest chapter of his career was now only a single film away, and neither Steve nor anyone else could have imagined just how dramatically his life was about to change. By 1984, Steve Guttenberg's years of persistence were finally about to pay off in a way that few actors ever experience. Hollywood is filled with talented performers who spend entire careers searching for one defining role. Steve found several in the span of just a few years. Almost overnight, his face became one of the most recognizable in America. Walk into a movie theater, browse the shelves of a video rental store, or flip through a magazine, and chances were Steve Guttenberg would be smiling back at you. For audiences who came of age during the 1980s, he wasn't simply another actor. He became part of the decade itself. The breakthrough arrived with Police Academy, a comedy that critics dismissed almost immediately. Many reviewers predicted it would quickly disappear, calling it crude and forgettable. But audiences saw something entirely different. They discovered a film that didn't ask to be taken seriously. It simply wanted people to laugh. At the center of the chaos stood Steve as Carrie Mahoney, the quick-witted troublemaker whose charm made him impossible to dislike. While outrageous characters surrounded him, Steve became the steady heartbeat of the story, the ordinary man guiding viewers through complete madness. Against every prediction, the film became one of the biggest box office successes of the year and launched a franchise that stretched across the decade. Overnight, Steve Guttenberg became a household name. Success, however,
did not trap him inside one genre. The following year, he reunited with director Ron Howard for Cocoon, a film that possessed warmth, humor, and surprising emotional depth. Surrounded by legendary performers, Steve never tried to outshine anyone else. Instead, he brought an easy sincerity that perfectly balanced the story's reflections on aging, love, and second chances. It was a film that resonated deeply with older audiences then, and continues to do so today, because its greatest subject was never science fiction. It was the universal hope that youth is not measured only by age, but by the spirit inside us. Then came Short Circuit, introducing an entirely new generation of children to Steve Guttenberg. As the compassionate inventor who befriends a robot discovering life for the very first time, he reminded audiences that intelligence and kindness could exist together. Families embraced the film, children adored Johnny Five, and Steve once again found himself at the center of another cultural phenomenon. Before the decade had reached its end, Three Men and a Baby became an even greater triumph, turning three unlikely bachelors into America's favorite on-screen family and becoming the highest-grossing film of 1987. Looking back today, what made Steve Guttenberg so beloved wasn't overwhelming charisma or dramatic intensity. It was something far rarer. He represented decency. In an era increasingly filled with larger-than-life action heroes, Steve reminded audiences that ordinary goodness could still carry a movie. Ironically, the very quality that made millions of people love him would eventually become the reason Hollywood began leaving him behind. The arrival of the 1990s brought more than just a new decade. It brought a completely different Hollywood. Audiences who had once embraced warm-hearted comedies suddenly craved darker stories, morally complicated heroes, and action stars with rougher edges. The industry that had celebrated kindness throughout much of the 1980s was now chasing something edgier, faster, and more unpredictable. Without realizing it, Steve Guttenberg had become the perfect leading man for an era that was quietly slipping away. It wasn't that he stopped working. In fact, he continued making films, appearing in family comedies, television productions, and independent projects. But something had changed. The blockbuster scripts no longer arrived with the same frequency. The major directors who once sought him out began searching for younger faces or actors willing to portray deeply flawed, emotionally darker characters. Steve understood what Hollywood wanted, but he also understood himself. Throughout his career, he had carefully avoided crossing certain lines, believing that entertainment did not always have to rely on cruelty, cynicism, or shock value. That personal choice earned him enormous respect from audiences who appreciated his wholesome image, but it also quietly narrowed the range of roles the industry imagined for him. Looking back, Steve himself admitted that his own personality may have become part of the challenge. Casting directors often struggled to picture him as a villain or a deeply troubled anti-hero because he projected such genuine warmth. He once reflected that people sometimes mistake kindness for weakness, especially in an industry that frequently rewards intensity over sincerity. It was an honest observation, and perhaps one that explains far more than declining box office numbers ever could. Hollywood didn't reject Steve Guttenberg because he lacked ability. It simply evolved toward a style of storytelling where his greatest strength was no longer fashionable. Yet while his professional life became quieter, another part of his life grew even more meaningful. Throughout every success and every disappointment, one constant remained: his father, Stanley. The man who had encouraged a frightened teenager to chase an impossible dream never stopped being Steve's greatest supporter. Years later, when Stanley's health began to fail, Steve repaid that lifelong devotion without hesitation. Week after week,
He made long journeys to help care for his father during exhausting dialysis treatments, placing family ahead of career opportunities. After Stanley passed away, Steve openly admitted that losing him was the deepest heartbreak of his life. More than a parent, Stanley had been his closest friend, his greatest teacher, and the quiet voice reminding him to keep looking toward whatever came next. In many ways, the most important role Steve Guttenberg ever played was not on a movie screen at all. It was the role of a grateful son who never forgot the man who believed in him before the rest of the world ever did.
Today, Steve Guttenberg no longer dominates movie posters or headlines the biggest Hollywood premieres. Instead, he lives a quieter life, one measured less by box office numbers than by the people he continues to inspire. During the devastating California wildfires in 2025, while many celebrities watched events unfold from a distance, Steve was out helping neighbors move abandoned cars so emergency vehicles could pass. It was exactly the kind of gesture that surprised no one who had followed his life. The man audiences had admired as the nice guy on screen had never stopped being that same person in real life.
Although he continues to act from time to time, Steve has found new ways to tell stories. He writes books, performs on stage, and shares thoughtful reflections with hundreds of thousands of followers who appreciate his optimism and gratitude. There is no bitterness in the way he speaks about Hollywood, no resentment toward younger stars who inherited the spotlight. Instead, he often reflects on how much of success depends on timing, opportunity, and a little bit of luck. It is a perspective that only someone who has experienced both extraordinary fame and quiet obscurity can truly understand. Perhaps that is why Steve Guttenberg's story feels even more meaningful today than it did during the height of his career. His legacy is not built on Academy Awards or record-breaking salaries. It lives in the memories of millions who grew up laughing with Police Academy, believing in the magic of Cocoon, cheering for Johnny Five in Short Circuit, or smiling through Three Men and a Baby. Those films remain snapshots of a gentler Hollywood, one where decency could still be the defining quality of a leading man. In the end, Steve Guttenberg may never have become another Tom Hanks, but perhaps he was never meant to. He became something far rarer, a star who refused to compromise the values that shaped him. Long after the applause faded and the cameras moved on, he remained exactly the man his father had encouraged him to be all those years ago: humble, gracious, and always ready to discover what comes next. And perhaps that is the greatest success any life can achieve.